The studio was a polished machine, a set filled with gliding cameras, bright artificial lights, and people who knew their roles down to the second. But something about that morning felt off. The director, Miles Trencher, a man known for his ego nearly as much as his cinematic flair, was already pacing behind the monitors. His headset hung loosely around his neck, and the sharp click of his boots echoed louder than usual. The production had been running on a tight schedule, and the whispers were spreading fast. The studio was growing impatient, and Miles was feeling the heat. Keanu stood quietly near the back of the set, dressed in costume but unassuming as ever. No trailer entourage, no loud phone calls. He was simply there, like a shadow waiting for his moment. He spoke softly to a crew member adjusting a prop, nodding thoughtfully. Everything about him was calm, measured. He checked the floor markings on the set himself, not needing anyone to guide him. And still, Miles glanced at him like a ticking clock, as if every second Keanu stood still was costing the film money. But Keanu wasn't stalling, he was thinking. He had asked for one more read-through, one small adjustment to the blocking. Not for ego, not to be difficult, but to protect the emotional truth of the scene. Miles saw it differently. From his vantage point behind the monitor, everything looked fine. He barked orders, raised his voice, asked why the cameras weren't rolling. The assistant director tried to explain Keanu's request, but Miles cut him off. Actors act, directors direct. He snapped, loud enough for half the crew to hear. Keanu looked over slowly but said nothing. His expression didn't change. He simply stepped aside, letting a technician pass, then walked to his mark with quiet readiness. The weight of professionalism hung heavy in the room, but so did the tension. The air was thick with unspoken anxiety, the kind that comes before something breaks. No one knew exactly when it would happen, but something about the way Miles tapped his clipboard, the way he stared through Keanu like a nuisance instead of a person, made the crew glance at each other with concern. The director's ego was colliding with Keanu's silence, and that kind of collision never ends quietly. The cameras were in place. The boom mic floated just out of frame. Keanu stood silently at his mark, eyes focused, the weight of the scene sitting on his shoulders. It was a complicated moment, not because of stunts or effects, but because of emotion. His character had just lost a son. The words were few, but the pain had to land without them. Keanu knew it. He had asked for stillness on set. No movement, no background chatter. The kind of environment where you could hear your own heartbeat. He waited for the slate, but it never came. Instead, footsteps, heavy, sharp, angry. Miles approached from behind the monitor, tearing off his headset and waving his hand in the air. Cut! Cut that! What are we doing? He barked, even though they hadn't rolled yet. We're 20 minutes behind because he's... What? Feeling it. His voice echoed across the warehouse-sized studio. The words weren't just loud, they were designed to shame. Technicians froze mid-adjustment. Even the grips stopped moving, unsure if they should look busy or invisible. Keanu blinked, then turned slowly toward the director. He said nothing, just gave a small tilt of his head. Not defiance, not arrogance, just a quiet request for clarity. Is there something I'm doing wrong? He asked, voice low and grounded. The question wasn't defensive. It wasn't confrontational. It was genuine. And maybe that made it worse for Miles. He needed a fight. Keanu refused to give him one. You're wasting everyone's time, Miles said, jabbing a finger toward the crew. You think the whole world pauses because you need to feel something. This is not a therapy session. This is a movie. Do your job. A long silence followed, the kind that presses on your chest like weight. Keanu stood still, not ashamed, not angry, still. He looked at the crew behind the lights, at the camera operators, the sound engineers, the makeup artists, all frozen in place, unsure where this was going. And that was the moment it all began to shift, not with shouting, not with threats, but with the unmistakable feeling that something had just cracked in the room. The lights overhead buzzed quietly as Miles stared down Keanu like a man trying to pick a fight he had already lost. There was something dangerous about the stillness in the air. No one dared move. The director's breathing grew louder, more erratic, filling the silence that Keanu refused to break. Miles was used to dominance, used to fear, used to actors retreating when he raised his voice. But this silence disarmed him, and in his mind that was a kind of defiance. Keanu didn't flinch, didn't step back. His eyes weren't even cold. They were calm. He was simply standing there, present, human. And maybe that's what enraged Miles the most, because in that moment he looked smaller. His authority felt hollow. The set was his, the film was his, but the respect in the room had drifted toward the man saying nothing. And without warning, without build-up or logic, Miles stepped forward and struck Keanu across the face. A sharp, open-handed slap. It was quick, loud, and cruel, the kind of sound that echoes in more than just your ears. The crew gasped. Several dropped what they were holding. The camera assistant's headset slipped. A makeup brush clattered to the floor. No one moved to stop it. No one believed it would happen. Not here, not like this, not to him. Keanu's head turned slightly from the impact. His hair shifted. His cheek flushed red. But he didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He simply stood back up straight and adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. His breathing remained steady. For a long moment, the world held its breath. No one spoke, not even Miles, because in that brief pause after violence, you hear the truth of a place. You hear the difference between fear and loyalty. And what Keanu did next wasn't loud or vengeful. It was simple. He turned toward the camera crew, nodded once, and said, "Let's reset." His voice didn't shake. His expression didn't twist. He didn't even look at Miles again. It was like the slap never happened. Not because it didn't matter, but because Keanu refused to give it power. And that's what changed everything. Keanu stepped away from the mark, slowly walking back toward the edge of the set. His posture was upright, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. But there was a shift in the room now, subtle but undeniable. The crew's eyes followed him, not out of pity, but out of something deeper, reverence. He had just taken a hit in front of the entire production, and yet, he wore the moment like it was weightless. There was no anger in his stride, no wounded pride, no theatrical retreat, just quiet, controlled presence. He stopped near the craft services table, picked up a paper cup of water, and took a sip. The red mark still burned across his cheek, but he didn't reach up to touch it. He didn't acknowledge it. He just stood there for a second longer before turning to a young production assistant, barely out of film school, and softly asked, "Are you doing okay?" The PA's eyes widened. Of all people on set, Keanu was the one checking on him. The young man nodded, but his voice caught in his throat. "Why, sir, I mean, yes." Keanu gave a small smile, then turned back toward the camera rig and said calmly, "Let me know when we're ready again." That simple moment shattered the last thread holding the set together. It wasn't the slap that broke the room. It was Keanu's refusal to react with hate. His dignity felt louder than any scream, stronger than any confrontation. Across the studio, one of the lighting technicians stepped away from her rig. She took off her headset, laid it on a nearby Apple box, and walked off the set without a word. No drama, no shouting, just quiet exit. Seconds later, a sound engineer followed, then the boom operator, then the dolly grip. Like a slow-motion wave, people began to step away, not in protest but in loyalty. They weren't quitting their jobs. They were standing up for a man who never asked them to, for a man who didn't defend himself with rage, but with composure. And in that stillness, he revealed something few in Hollywood ever truly understand. Real power doesn't need to be loud, just needs to be real. By now, the set wasn't just silent, it was hollow, like the soul had drained out of the room. Miles stood frozen near the monitors, one hand still clenched, the other now gripping his director's chair like it could keep him anchored. But it could not, because across the room, something bigger than a film was unfolding. The crew wasn't just leaving, they were choosing something rare, something sacred. They were choosing respect over reputation, heart over hierarchy. The first to speak was Helena, the script supervisor. She had worked with Miles on 3 previous projects, known for her precision and poise. She stepped toward the center of the set, clipboard still in hand, but her voice clear. "If this is the kind of film we're making, I can't be part of it." She didn't make a scene. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply walked out. The second was Martin, head of lighting, who pulled the dimmer board sliders down one by one, until the set dimmed into a soft gray wash. Then he too walked away. Each departure was quiet, but in its quiet, devastating. Miles barked orders. "Get back here. We're not finished. This is my set." But the words fell flat, bouncing off empty air. The sound guy shook his head and unplugged his rig. The wardrobe team left the trailer doors swinging open behind them. Even the assistant director, the one who had tried to calm Miles earlier, handed off his clipboard and said only, "You crossed the line." And he didn't. There was no coup, no chaos, just calm, deliberate disconnection. The machine stopped working not because it broke, but because the people inside it refused to run it anymore. Keanu never asked them to stay, and he never asked them to leave. He just stood by the edge of the set, hands loosely at his sides, eyes lowered in thought. He hadn't moved in minutes. When one of the PAs approached to offer him a ride back to the lot, Keanu gently declined. "I think I'll walk," he said, his voice quiet, measured. As the last crew member stepped through the studio doors, she turned back, a young woman from the art department, and gave Keanu a small nod. He returned it, and that was it. The scene wasn't filmed, but everyone would remember it forever. By noon, the set was silent, not because it was meant to be, but because it had been emptied by choice. The craft table still had fresh coffee steaming, untouched. The cameras were still mounted, untouched. But the people, they were gone. Miles Trencher sat alone in his director's chair, headset limp around his neck, his voice hoarse from shouting at no one. His authority, the fear he once wielded like a sword, had evaporated, undone by something he could neither control nor comprehend. Outside the studio gates, the crew didn't gather or rally. They didn't post to social media. They didn't scream into the void. They simply went home or sat in their cars or called their families. Because what had happened wasn't for publicity, it was for principle. The word still spread, of course, quietly at first. A camera tech told a friend on another set. A boom op texted a colleague. And by the end of the day, agents, producers, and execs across the city had heard the same story. Miles slapped Keanu, and the crew left. But it wasn't the slap that people remembered. It was what followed. The stillness, the silence, the integrity. Keanu didn't sue. He didn't issue a press statement. He didn't retaliate. When asked by reporters about the day's events, he only said, "We all choose how we show up." Chose quiet. They chose loyalty. That's all. His words became more than a quote. They became a lesson. Acting schools, film sets, and corporate workshops began referencing the walkout scene, not for drama, but for dignity. Weeks later, the studio quietly announced that the film had been shelved. Miles Trencher was let go from 3 pending projects. No one celebrated his downfall, not even Keanu, because it was never about revenge. It was about remembering that kindness, even when humiliated, carries power. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The kind that sits, breathes, and changes the world without lifting a single hand. And as for Keanu, he returned to work a few months later, on a small indie film far from studio lights, surrounded by a crew who knew exactly who he was. Not just a star, but a man whose silence was louder than violence, and far more lasting.